Is it? Yes, it is. Thanks a lot, Vittorio, for the invitation and also for this kind words. Also for the publicity for our book, which is still reprinted, and there's also the application for all of these cities, which is free to download. Now I don't see my presentation. Is this normal? Yeah. Or I should sit myself over it. I can start, but maybe you could help me to arrange. So maybe we come back to Aldo Rossi. Of course, he was at ETH, but there is not a direct link from him to us, even if Herzog and Dömer, for instance, for whom we worked in our internship, were studying there, and Roger Diem is an important reference too. It went through Hans Kohlhoff. It was more kind of this, and I will come back to Hans Kohlhoff. So
can we adjust?
I can start and you can adjust. I would like to enter into our thoughts about type and typology with a quotation from Raphael Moneo, quite long. You might all know it, but still I think it's worth rereading it, which he published in 1978 in Oppositions. So we discovered this text for ourselves while working on our publication Typology, and it has become for us the most important writing in its clarity, but also in its searching openness from the perspective of a designing architect. He begins with with his text to raise the question of typology and architecture, to raise a question of the nature of the architectural work itself. To answer it means for each generation a redefinition of the essence of architecture and an explanation of all its attendant problems. This in turn requires the establishment of a theory whose first question must be what kind of object is a work of architecture. This question ultimately has to return to the concept of type. So this is interesting for us as for two respects. First, Moneo claims that architecture and typology are intimately connected. And second, the term typology is for him changeable in time. So the model itself changes with time and with architecture. Now the question is, well, what is this first question? What kind of object is a work of architecture? He goes on the one hand, the work of architecture has to be considered in its own right as an entity in itself. That is, like other forms of art, it can be characterized by a condition of uniqueness. From this point of view, the work of architecture is irreducible within any classification. It is unrepeatable, a single phenomenon. And then he goes on with the but. On the other hand, a work of architecture can also be seen as belonging to a class of repeated objects, characterized like a class of tools or instruments by some general attributes. From the first hut to the archaic stone construction, primitive architecture conceived of itself as an activity similar to other kinds of craftsmanship, such as the making of textiles, pottery, baskets, and so on. The first products of this activity, which we in retrospect have called architecture, were no different from instruments or tools. Building a primitive hut required solving problems of form and design similar in nature to those involved in weaving a basket, that is, in making a useful object. Thus, like a basket or plate or cup, the architectural object could not only be repeated, but also was meant to be repeated. In this sense, the uniqueness of the architectural object, I won't read the whole book, was denied. The uniqueness of the architectural object was denied. From this point of view, a work of architecture construction, a house, like a boat, a cup, a helmet, can be defined through formal features which express problems running from production to use and which permit its reproduction. In these terms, it can be said that the essence of the architectural object lies in its repetibility. So this definition of architecture raises fundamental question. What is the role of the designer? The concept of the fountainhead and the star architect standing above the real world in the sky is not compatible with such a definition. Rather, an architectural work is both the work of an architect, an author, and also, at EAA, we were asking the question of authorship, no? But also that belongs to and shares with a group of works characteristics that were not invented by the author, but which are the product of a long and slow development process in which countless have participated. An architectural work, a project, is always also work of an extended, anonymous, collective authorship. It is a work of a civilization, of a culture. As banal as this statement may seem, it is central to our daily work as designers. We do not invent, but we design, we project, we entwerfen, we throw something forward, and what we throw forward is already there. It has traveled a long way. We always work on something that others have designed before us. Our raw material is cultural products. Designing means dealing with one's own cultural foundations. Being an architect means working on cultural heritage. Having studied and graduated under Hans Kohlhoff, we have acquired a fundamental discomfort with modernism. To put it somewhat simplistically, his architecture began where modernism sought a break with history, where the tradition of architecture, the continuity of its development breaks off. Hans Kohlhoff sketches a way in which the history of architecture, alternatively to modernism, could have proceeded. Just as Philip Roth muses in Plot Against America, how would history might have proceeded if Franklin D. Roosevelt had no longer been elected president and the US had not subsequently entered World War II, because Lindbergh, a president-elect, seeks peace with Nazi Germany, with which he sympathizes. Kohlhoff muses how the world would have looked if modernism had not taken part. Had not taken the scepter. The continuity of architectural culture, cities built on without the rupture of modernism. As part of our teaching at ETH, we traveled to Hong Kong with our students. And what did we find here? A dense, homogeneous, physically present city, anonymous, repetitive, expressive houses, vital, precise urban spaces. All the postulates of our teacher Kohlhoff seem to be fulfilled here. A somehow traditional city, but built in 20th century from modern buildings. An experience that in reverse recalls the anecdote described by Rem Koolhaas in Delirious New York. Le Corbusier comes to New York, and what he finds, the modern city, is already there. In Hong Kong, on the other hand, we found a different modernity, not the ideological, but the actually built one, not the manifest one, but one in which modern principles of economy and demand, of technology and topography are reflected in the urban structure and its architecture. For us, Hong Kong stands for the way out of the trickiest situation our teacher had put us in. A city whose urban qualities more than lived up to Kohlhoff standards, but built from modern architecture. Hong Kong was proof that modern and urban were not necessarily contradictions, but that it had to be possible to design and build modern cities today. Why is Hong Kong modern? Why is Hong Kong's modern architecture able to create an urban coherent city structure? The city of exemplary buildings led to our Hong Kong typology. We collected and described, to say it with Monet's words, the formal features which express problems running from production to use and which permit its reproduction. In order to capture the almost infinite pool of buildings, classes were formed that were distinguished from other classes by such common features. Pencil towers, vertical factories, block buildings, for instance. But Hong Kong also shows that architecture is always a work in its own right. The buildings have architectural formal qualities that in their beauty and power put the boldest dreams of German expressionists in the shade. And what is crucial here, unique objects and part of a class are not contradictory aspects that tear apart a project, a work, but just the opposite is the case. It is precisely because an object is characterized by qualities it shares with a group that it becomes so powerful as an object. The beauty of the pencil tower owes as much to the individual form as to the regularity inherent in the pencil tower type. And this is the pencil tower. The type is thus defined by common characteristics of a group of individual buildings, and typology is the collection of such types. With the Hong Kong typology, we described the architecture of the city. limiting ourselves to what a typology can do. It captures only the typical buildings based on repeated characteristics. In other words, the broad, mostly anonymous mass that, depending on the city, makes up a greater or lesser proportion of the substance. Hong Kong is built almost exclusively of buildings that can be typologically assigned. Hong Kong as a city is perfectly describable in terms of type and typology. Moneo's model in the understanding of architecture as a unique work on the one hand and part of a group of works on the other, the idea of the city as a collection of works with similar characteristics is already inherent. The relationship of architecture and the city through the notion of typology is, of course, the great theme of Italian post-war architecture theory. Moneo discusses some of them in his text, for example, Muratori. Against the failure of the modern movement to use type in terms of the city, a new series of writings began to appear in the 60s, which called for a theory to explain the formal and structural continuity of traditional cities. These saw the city as a formal structure which could be understood through a continuous historical development. From this point of view, architecture was considered neither as a single artistic event proposed by the avant-garde, nor the industrially reproduced object, but now as a process in time of building from the single dwelling to the total city. So this discovery of history as a method of investigation of the city has, simply put, also led to a turn towards historical architecture, a point that Moneo criticizes quite harshly. He talks about Krier, for instance, that talking about typology leads into a kind of a historicist architecture. So art helped to us to see the model of type and typology as a radically contemporary way of relating architecture and the city. In contrast to this theoretical turn to the historical city, which always has something nostalgic about it, there is at the same time an interest in art for industrial, modern, or even contemporary architecture and the city. Bernd and Hilla Becher systematically examine the buildings of industrial culture and present them according to type, a typology of the industrial age. Ed Roche examines the built artifacts in Los Angeles, again systematically. Architecture as a mass product, architecture without architects, architecture that therefore represents contemporary civilization, architecture that is real. Gas stations, parking lots, real estate. No, this is some Los Angeles apartments, the swimming pools, and every house on Sunset Strip. Typology as method and representation is directly related to everyday life, to popular culture. The reality of our civilization is a reality of mass, of multiplication. Typological work, working in series, becomes a systematic methodology. We have extended this research to other cities built in the 20th century. Each of these cities has developed very specific building types in a specific constellation of framework conditions, of economy and topography, of building laws and climate, of political visions, technical conditions, and cultural conventions. Hong Kong, Rome, New York, and Buenos Aires in the first one, Athens, Sao Paulo, New Delhi, and Paris in the second one. In New York, types that solve the conflict between economic pressure and illumination of the buildings. Later, after the invention of the fluorescent tube, when buildings could get as fed as possible, unlimitedly fed, types that, based on building laws, these ones, guarantee the illumination of the street space in a defined minimum. Buenos Aires, Davide was showing the colonial city in Cordoba, Argentina, no? These blocks, you remember these schemes, which based on the generous grid of the new foundations in the Spanish, sorry, this is still New York. Buenos Aires, which based on the generous grid of the new foundations in the Spanish colonies laid out on flat courtyard houses, has become a small parceled high-rise city. Therefore, houses have to find a way to deal with the blocks that are too large, aggravated by the narrow lots that are increasingly divided up due to economic pressure. Rome, which grew after becoming the capital of Italy, then again substantially under Mussolini, and once more thanks to the Marshall Plan after World War II, the demand of a bourgeoisie for representative living, which, compromised by the economic possibilities, leads to the palazzina, these ones, in contrast to the large-scale block structures, mostly for lower classes. Sorry. New Delhi, where all the cultural self-confidence of newly independent India, with its rich culture and social democratic vision, is reflected in spectacular housing, built with simple means, mostly without elevators and therefore low, highly complex structures which realize an Indian modernism based on vernacular types as a replacement of colonial architecture. Athens with the type of the polykatekia in an infinite homogeneous urban structure with little capital based on a specific law that allows different owners in multi-story buildings. We liked that even the parking lots have somehow the same structure as the housing. Sao Paulo, little control, high economic potential, unstable political framework, therefore typologically difficult to grasp, but nevertheless developing types such as vertical parking garages with their closed brick facades. Paris, in particular, its urban expansion along the peripheric, which is in cautious steps increasingly enlivens the Haussmannian maxim of monotonous and enclosed building forming the street space, open it up on the basis of hygienic considerations, and increasingly develops the light wells and backyards into designed urban spaces. The architecture of these cities shows us that the concept of type and the understanding of architecture whose individual quality is based on the foundation of a communal cultural development is compatible with modern architecture. And that type is not dead and not a dead scheme, but constantly evolving. The most intense moments in architectural development are those when a new type appears. One of the architect's greatest efforts, and thus the most deserving of admiration, is made when he gives up a known type and clearly sets out to formulate a new one. Often, external events, such as new techniques or changes in society, are responsible for impelling him toward his creation of a new type. A type is bound to a specific geographical and historical situation. The changes of these situations, for instance by historical changes, bring the type into a crisis and lead to its further development, or in the extreme case, to its disappearance. And if it is transferred to another situation, it will also be subject to changes. A type, this is the quintessence of Moneo's text, is changeable. Precisely therein lies its peculiarity and its potential. By type, we understand a specific principle of an architecture in which a solution for a complex set of requirements is realized in a condensed way, a solution to a standardized problem optimized over a long development process. Since a principle is an abstraction, it is generally available. It can be applied. The type is available to the designer as an offer, a kind of conserved design work. If a farmer has to build a barn in a Swiss mountain valley, he will not take a white sheet and a pencil, analyze the situation, make volume studies, and then slowly approach a floor plan solution. Instead, the solution is clear from the start. The type of barn is known, right down to the last detail of the roof construction. If necessary, he will make improvements based on experience with an already built barn and thus slightly modify the type. He will increase the roof overhang, use new material if available, such as concrete instead of stone. And he will adapt the type to the situation, to an existing building, to the topography, to the geometry of the plot. Thus, based on the type, a concrete building is created, which in turn shapes the type in a new, slightly different way. The type is not dead, but in a constant, sometimes rapid, sometimes very slow development. Now, the situation for the farmer is fundamentally different from ours. The moment we ask ourselves the question about tradition, tradition dies. Our consciousness does not allow us to follow tradition without reflection. If we follow it, it is a conscious decision. We can nevertheless make use of the type as it can we nevertheless make use of the type as a design tool, as complex requirements are elegantly solved in a type? The most radical way we were able to use a type in a project was when we designed a competition project for social housing in Intramuros. That means within the peripheric in the 15th arrondissement in Paris. The fact that we are not from Paris, but look at the city from outside, and that we had studied Paris in our typology, came to our aid. The relationship to the street with the modulation of the facade alignment, which in deliberate deviation from Osman's principles rhythmicizes the facade. The facade composition as an almost infinite repetition of the always same French window type, and the organization of the floor plan as cells that form enfilades via generous doors. This type exists, and it was applicable here. The project consists on the one hand of the decision for a type, and on the other hand of its situational fitting. The geometry of the street gives the house a specific appearance. The facade construction is very cheap steel sheet on a wooden substructure is a response to the extreme cost pressure. Other elements, on the other hand, could be used unchanged, such as the typical folding shutters, which are part of the type because they are decisive for the appearance of the facade, which in turn has to do with the urban setting. Urban design to detail are related, and the type summarizes these internal structural features. The building is therefore typically Parisian. It bears typical features of the architecture of Paris, and is therefore capable of dialogue in its context. It shares characteristics with its neighbors, which makes it perceived as part of the urban structure. It does not step out. There is no moral impetus behind this, no modesty or shyness, but on the contrary, a high demand not to create an isolated object, but rather to continue building the city, because the house works in context, the context itself becomes the project. This path is only possible in certain situations, when the task is comparable to those questions that had led to the genesis of the type. Mostly, however, we architects today are confronted with tasks that are highly specific. The functional requirements are complex, the building code rules complicated, the plots full of exceptions. Far from a typical case, a priori typical solution is therefore non-existent. Should architecture consequently be developed from scratch in every case, out of nothing? Is each project therefore a unique creation that does not belong to a class of repeated objects? Moneo, from the perspective of the designing architect, outlines the potential of type in the design process. In this continuous process of transformation, the architect can extrapolate from the type, changing its use. He can distort the type by means of transformation of scale. He can overlap different types to produce new ones. He can use formal quotations of a known type in a different context, as well as create new types by a radical change in the techniques already employed. The list of different mechanisms is extensive. It is a function of the intensiveness of architects. In our work, we try to achieve the general attributes. Architectural design, as we understand our work, is always the struggle for an organizing principle in which an urban, organizational, social intention is expressed. How does a house stand in its environment? How are its spaces related to the outside and to each other? And what kind of use is possible with it? If not the type as a whole can be consulted, then fragments of types can. In the case of the Kunstmuseum Basel, it was the cross-shaped floor plan that is used twice, two archaic houses, so to speak, that grow together attached to a garden wall. The windows belong to these houses, fragments of a palazzo, and as such related to the existing building from the 1930s, the existing museum, who itself refers to the type of the Italian palazzo. And the industrial-looking staircase, which provides access to these two houses in the space between, like the access to a silo or a vertical factory, which is arranged peripherally and does not affect the usable areas, a kind of a crossover of local houses and the industrial DNA of modern art. Decisive. In the design process is the work on the plaster model. In this urban planning model, we investigate volume variance. Volume stands for an idea of the internal organization and thus of the way the house will function, how it will be used. We call it scenario. How do we imagine life in this building? This is critically dependent on how a house behaves in a context. In other words, the project starts with defining a structure that determines both how the house relates to its surroundings and how it functions inside. The design work then consists of developing that structure. Paradoxically, to solve this overdefined equation, it is necessary to combine the complex framework of the plot and the building laws with the complex functional requirements of the program, that of a general structure. I'm careful not to call it the structure type already, and yet it is more than just a geometric pattern. In a geometric principle, functioning or construction are already inherent, and the design process pursues the goal of developing these relationships so that the solution is as general as possible, as simple and clear as possible. So we aim to relate the interior of a house to its behavior in a context, to make it internal, private functioning, and its public, external functioning become one project. In this way, the house becomes a player in the city, a city building block. In this way, our ideal of architecture differs diametrically from authorial star architecture, whose goal is uncompromising uniqueness. This may work in Doha or Wolfsburg or Shanghai, where the celebration of uniqueness makes sense, where these projects based on the authority of the designer become mass-produced. The result is only a Babylonian bubble of voices, not a city. Our grey houses are a statement for an architecture that places the relationship to its surrounding above the dominance of its appearance. In terms of craftsmanship, nothing seems as difficult to us today as creating order in a project. The complexity of the requirements combined with the constraints of a parcel of land drive the projects toward a highly specific construct that is a collection of solutions to problems. The challenge is to develop a form that is fundamentally simple, which is based on a system that can be described. Initially, the setting of such a system will create conflict. A system makes determinations which cannot satisfy all requirements, because these requirements are amorphous. This creates then the conflicts with clients. This design process consists in bringing these amorphous requirements into an architectural structure. The described conflicts have to be overcome, the problems have to be solved. Only where there is a problem can architecture emerge as a solution. If now the complex requirements are answered with an architectural system, an architecture arises which is a development for this one specific case, but which is systematic at the same time and in its approaches or fragments of a type possess. It thus rises above the specific case. In relation to the question surrounding the responsibility use of material use, we see a link to the ecological challenge of our time. Only when an architecture emancipates itself from its initial requirements, when it finds a general form, can it survive changes in these requirements. Just as the spacious, typologically clear apartments of the 19th century still function perfectly well today under completely different social conditions, while the specific too narrowly cut apartments of the 1950s to today are becoming a burden, a legacy. What will one day become of the architecture we design? Our responsibility is to design typologically and constructively so that our buildings have a future. A functional and technical constructive one, but also a cultural one. If their form is based on an architectural systematic, if it says something about the organization of the house, about its structure, it is fundamental and logical. It will be able to be understood by the next generation. Whereas a form based on cultural codes will be understood in the future at most as a historical artifact of a particular era. The search in the design process for order is also the search for an architectural form that will stand the test of time. It is therefore not only functional and technical sustainable, but also cultural sustainable. We call this the sustainability of form. Ultimately, the question which remains is, does it make sense to speak of type today? To summarize what has been said in 3 points, which seem to us important today, aspects that might be aspects of this 5th typology. First, the model of type helps us to free architecture from the presumptuous claim to be an author's ingenious invention and to place out our own work as architects in a productive relationship to the history of architecture and understand our profession also in a collaborative art way. Second, the typical unifying is inherent in the type and contains a holistic understanding of structure, use, and expression, which is why the model helps to clarify the relationship between building and the city. It can be a tool to develop better urban spaces. And third, against the backdrop of ecological challenges, the model of type can help to develop buildings whose structure has characteristics that, thanks to their general qualities, outlast longer periods of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph, for this very interesting and very clear presentation, which I think was really a one-to-one take on type. And of course, I have a lot of questions, which maybe I shouldn't ask all of them, because I think I'm sure there are also questions from the audience. But there is one question in particular that rose to my mind, listening to you, but also looking again, actually, some of the pages of the book on typology that you produce. And to explain myself, I refer to an interview with an Italian photographer, Guido Guidi. He's actually one of the Italian new topographics, let's say, who in the 1970s and 80s, he was photographing actually anonymous landscapes in the Italian periphery and countryside. And his photographs are actually really part of this kind of wave that, you know, German photographers, American photographers, Stephen Shore or Thomas Struth, who actually made the urban landscapes the protagonist of their photography. And certainly is a generation of photographers that was very much influenced by art photography like Ed Ruscha. And in a way, all their work has this interest for the deadpan, for the banal. And in this interview, Guido Guidi was saying, you know, today is very difficult to make these photographs because at that time you really could find this architecture that was looking very anonymous. And today you can, you go to the Italian countryside and buildings are really loud, you know, they're actually very designed, full of tropes. You can hardly find like a blind wall or, just like windows, you know. And in a way, looking at the images of your buildings, you know, I mean, the beauty, there is a beauty, and you actually were not afraid to be explicit about that. The beauty of these buildings has a lot to do with anonymity. These pencil towers, of course, I mean, one can question them socially and politically, but when you see this relentless abstraction, where you have just a staircase, an elevator, and a room, in a way, they also make legible the conditions in which this, they're almost diagrams of the conditions that produce these buildings without any further embellishment, And it seems to me that in your studies, this is the quality you're searching for. I mean, I wouldn't call it a certain honesty, but a certain kind of straightforwardness of architecture. And I don't know, I have the feeling that this is one of the most difficult things to design today, because architecture is, on the contrary, especially when it comes from designers, it's really meant to be very visible, very marketable as an image. And, this blankness, this abstraction that is, almost, I would say, abstract classicism that emerge in these typologies is very specific to a kind of architecture, a kind of modern architecture, no? That today, it seems to me, is more difficult to find in a way. Where even, let's say, a building made by an anonymous architect, who certainly was not maybe aspiring to publish his, his project on a magazine, somehow managed to make this very, very beautiful but simple architectures. I mean, it seems to me that in a way it's a quality that we can only find in a certain period, which is maybe the 1950s, 1940s to, or 1930s to 1960s. I don't know. I mean, that's
in Hong Kong until 1990s, huh?
Or 1990s. But I don't know. Today it seems to me more difficult to find this this kind of vernacular, modern vernacular. That's my question.
There were lots of aspects. Of course, I also admit there is a certain nostalgic and atmospheric take in it, that where we should also be careful not to be kind of develop kind of cynical view on this architecture and idealize it. But nevertheless, the examples that I was showing from Hong Kong, they have nearly kind of a classicist beauty. And what is why do I call it classicist? Because it's based on the structural elements of the building itself, of the tectonics, of repetition, of what the building is. And some of them have some really beautiful features. For instance, this round courtyard, which is for ventilation in the tropical climate, has a beautiful kind of piece of art as a floor. No, you look down and then you have this colorful. So there is a certain refinement, and I think it's important. Yes. Otherwise, it's getting inhuman. We don't kind of cultivate the brutality of architecture. But of course, there is a certain monotony and maybe even melancholy in it, which today is, which I find much more brutal, kind of hidden behind this neoliberal happiness and colorful cladding of fells, marble fells, timber fells, you know, the hotel over there, no? This kind of pretended happiness, which is much more sad and much more kind of disrespectful towards architecture and lately to the human being, no?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I mean, there is one. I mean, maybe I should not, but we're doing good with time, so maybe I can make another question. Actually, we spoke before about the how this kind of discourse on type has certain kind of reference, and actually you mentioned Hans Koloff was actually a very influential teacher here in Switzerland, although of course he's from Germany. And of course, Koloff at a certain point, I mean, he had this complete drift towards a kind of Biedermeier utopia. But before that, there is a moment in German architecture, especially in the work of Ungers and Koloff, where they look at Berlin, for example, especially through photography and redrawing, and they look to this, what you would call gray architecture. I think there is maybe there is also an influence with Gerhard Richter, this sort of interest again in the kind of deadpan, in a certain kind of brutalism. I mean, not intentional brutalism. For example, Ungers look to the urban villas. He looks to the blank walls, and Koloff actually looks to the Terranwags. I mean, looks to certain kind of anonymous architecture. And it seems to me that the kind of the atmosphere that you evoke through this mapping continues, that which was lost, because of course both Ungers and Koloff went to something else. In a way, they lost this kind of urban quality of this realism, if you want, in their work.
To be honest, I don't know Unger so well, but his really revolutionary take was to develop an urban project out of what is found. No? Yes. To go there and to see the walls of the around the gardens, the fences, the backyard house. Not to kind of impose a modernist utopia, which is a generic vision, but to really look at what is there, look at the reality, and to get rid of these abstract concepts of modernity. That's what Koloff, of course, was very strongly also transmitting. Look, and therefore there is, of course, then the closeness to Aldo Rossi. Architecture is architecture. It is rooted in its own discipline, and it's not kind of coming from outside.
Right. Yeah. Any question to Christoph, David?
Hi, thank you so much for the really great lecture. I had a question that maybe brings a little bit on the side, but I think with your experience, I have to ask this, which is, in a sense, I mean, we're talking now about typology, and the discussion is moving on a certain level of abstraction, in a sense. But my question is, do we still have, as architects, kind of agency on the construction process, let's say? Because it seems to me that this is also, as Moneo somehow talks about, this idea that architecture is about repetition, that also implies a certain construction techniques in a way. And it seems architects are more and more constrained by all sorts of regulations and processes, let's say, that basically they have to accept somehow. And so I was wondering, in your experience, if this is still something we could push, because it seems to me that it's one of the areas, let's say, that, well, the gray areas in which lots would need to be done.
Well, cultural pessimism is not really attractive, no. It's always a kind of a power game. Of course, architects are in a certain position, and they have to defend their profession, and we have lots of abilities that others don't have. For instance, I think construction will have to change in a radical way if we want to react to the ecological challenges. No, so the question of reuse will completely change our profession if we take it serious. And I think these moments of change are always a possibility where we architects who think a little bit more than just the real estate developers can also kind of acquire new territory. So, of course, in the standard production, we are not needed, no. But if we can develop new things, and I think we have to, no, then this is a possibility of occupying the terrain.
Maybe not really a question, more like a comment or a compliment. Maybe I thought that it was a really fantastic presentation, that so inspiring for me, especially because you brought up actually two themes that in these 2 days, because yesterday we saw also the PhD presentations, were not brought up yet, and that I find really, really exciting. And one is really this question of the structure that somehow, Davide is picking up on also. I mean, this moment that you highlight the fact that type has to cut through structure, use, and expression, that I thought it's quite striking, and we haven't discussed that until now. But I thought that was particularly interesting, because I think the moment that we tie up the structure with really the tectonic structure, even the detail you mentioned at a certain point in your own work when you show us the windows in Paris, I thought that was brilliant, because it made a kind of link with the moment when you were telling us about the barn, and about the fact that actually when you build a barn, you know all the stages that you have to go through, including tectonic detail, right? And to me, this idea of tying in the tectonic detail or the tectonic logic, let's say, with type, seems very exciting, because it going back to this question of honesty that you were raising earlier, it seems to embed in a very legible way the labor process somehow, or the process of production actually of the building. And that I thought was really interesting, because it's, in a way, it's a kind of answer to this kind of ongoing question that we had also this morning about the way in which actually type can engage with labor, with construction, with its own process of production. And I think the moment that you put the structure, the tectonic detail into the mix of type that we haven't done until now, then that makes really sense to me. And it really enriches somehow our understanding of type. To me, that's linked to the other thing that I really loved in your presentation, there is this idea of readability or understandability that you brought up at several points actually in the lecture. I thought that that was really interesting because very often in my own work, more as a historian, when I go back to try to actually post-rationalize types, they seem almost like a conspiracy theory somehow that was, put in place to organize people without really telling them explicitly, hey, we are doing this. But actually, if we flip the story and we say, no, we can use type as an instrument of readability and understandability, then I think that there's a lot of political agency in that. And I think that that's tied in with the question of the readability of the tectonic detail, right? Making it explicit why you're making certain choices. And so I thought that these two themes, the theme of readability and the theme of embedding the tectonic detail, were, extremely original in comparison with everything that we've been discussing until now. And so I hope that maybe they can continue to be woven through the conversation as we go forward. It's not really a question, but it's just that I really love these 2 points.
Okay. Thank you, Christoph. Thanks a lot.